to introduce our other two guests up here on stage today. You can already hear Roger, he can't be quiet over here. But this is Roger Holland. He is from Rutherford County. He's from the Henrietta area. And I've been told by many people that he's the best banjo player around. So we had to get him for this. And he's been in bands such as Carolina Crossfire, and he's played with people all over the county and the region. So he's highly recognized. So we're really glad to have Roger Holland here tonight. Named after the place where Earl was born and raised. My other guest today is J.T. Scruggs. He has been involved with the Earl Scruggs Center since before it was ever established. He was involved with Destination Cleveland County, which is a group of folks in Cleveland County who decided to use our cultural heritage to increase tourism in the area. So they are responsible, and J.T. was a big part of this for establishing the Don Gibson Theater and then the Earl Scruggs Center. He was the founding chair of the Earl Scruggs Center, and he is J.T. Scruggs. He's Earl's nephew. His father was Earl's brother, Junie. Anything else you want to say, JT? You want to play the banjo?
I think it's not fair that you put me behind Roger.
And another thing about JT, he's also been instrumental in the founding of the Earl Scruggs Music Festival, which we just had our second event this past weekend. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So.
Yeah, but she will sell herself short. She is a much bigger part of the festival. Does a lot more of the work than I do.
So our talk tonight is going to be a little bit different than most talks that I give about Earl. When we talk about Earl, a lot of times we just talk about his music and his accomplishments and his worldwide fame. But for this talk tonight, because his history matters and it's here in Rutherford County, I really want to dig into Earl's roots, into his family roots, and then also to the music that influenced Earl before Earl here in Cleveland and Rutherford County. So that's what we're going to dig into tonight. And it's kind of a preview of a very special exhibit that we're going to have opening at the Earl Scruggs Center in January of 2024. On January 6th, 2024, we'll be celebrating Earl's 100th birthday. So we're currently putting together this special exhibit that really roots Earl in this area and talks about what made Earl the musician he was. So when we talk about the region where Earl was born and raised, we call it at the Earl Scruggs Center, we call it the Broad River region. I don't know if anyone else calls it that, but we sort of coined that term to talk about the three counties of Rutherford, Cleveland, and Cherokee County in South Carolina. And you kind of see this map here, and they're all sort of situated around the Broad River. And it's an important geographic feature, but that's not all. You know, county lines are, not hard barriers. Families crossed. There were exchanges of goods and services throughout the area. And then, most importantly, for Earl, there was the exchange of the cultural traditions and the music. It's also important to remember that Cleveland County was part of Rutherford County until 1841. So it wasn't until that time that Cleveland County split off from part of Rutherford and part of Lincoln County. So when we talk about the families in the area, they're in all three of those counties. Many of the families in the area settled this Carolina backcountry, and that's what this area is called, by the way of the Great Wagon Road. And you can see the the map of the Great Wagon Road, where it starts in Philadelphia, and it comes down through the hills, through West Virginia, into North Carolina, and then into South Carolina. So many of the families in this area settled that way. So the two families we're going to talk about in regards to Earl and the Scruggs family, they sort of settled a back roads way. And that they sort of followed the Great Wagon Road, but they kind of came down the East Coast a little bit more. And then they went by way of Georgia, and then by the late 1700s, they'd come back up to the Cliffside area, to Cowpens Cliffside area. And one of the first settlers, or the Scruggs settlers in that area, was Richard Scruggs. The Root family, they came from that direction, and they followed the more like normal route of the Great Wagon Road. And the Root family, that was Earl's mother's family. And if you think about before Earl, and you think about what Cleveland County, Rutherford County, Cherokee County, what this whole area was like, it was primarily agrarian communities. You know, people had small farms. They were sharecroppers, tenant farmers, or they had, or they owned farms. But then by the late 1800s, we saw the development of the textile industry in both Cleveland and Rutherford County. So that's what primarily employed people at the time. And of course, we got to talk about the music in the Broad River region, and I titled it Big E before Earl. So at the turn of the 20th century, there were a lot of notable musicians in this area. Of course, they're not nationally famous because, the radio's just now coming about. People aren't touring around the country yet. But the style of music that they're playing is what we now call like old-time music or string band music, primarily guitars, fiddles, banjos. And music at that time was a really important part of community life. A lot of the social events were centered around music. Almost every small community had their own fiddle contest, banjo contest, things like that. And then social events too. There were often dances and things like that. And then we also see a lot of really good musicians collaborating with each other, primarily from the Bowling Springs area, the Cliffside area, and the Gaffney area. So we see folks from around this Broad River region collaborating together. And I wanted to mention some of the notable influences on Earl. And these might be people that you've heard about, particularly here in Rutherford County. Rex Brooks was a Rutherford County banjo player. He's one of the first to play a three-finger style, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Mac Woolbright, he was from upstate South Carolina. He was a blind banjo player, and he was someone who Earl talked about as being an influence on him. He heard him play. He was sort of electrified by what he heard there. One we'll talk about in depth is Smith Hammett, who was a major influence on Earl. Snuffy Jenkins, probably the second most famous banjo player from this area. Grady Wilkie, he was a guitar player, and we'll talk more about him. He was a mentor to Earl. And then, of course, the Scruggs and the Root family members, who were all musical folks, who were a major influence on Earl. So first, let's talk about Smith Hammett. How many of you in here have heard of Smith Hammett? So he was the hottest banjo player of the region, BE, before Earl. He played a three-finger style, and he was a major influence on Earl. And the story goes from a family member that he, originally what they call him a banjo player, which is kind of the old-time style that you hear in the mountains, you associate it with mountain music. But then he went with George Elam Scruggs, who was Earl's father, probably Judy Scruggs, and some other family members down at Flint Hill School to hear a black banjo player play, and that's the first time they heard a three-finger style. And supposedly, Smith Hammett stayed after that show and had that banjo player show him what he was doing, and he did not stop until he perfected the style. And so he was really one of the first banjo players in the area to really proliferate the three-finger style, and that's who Snuffy Jenkins heard it from. The Hammett family and the Scruggs and the Root family, they were very close. His wife, Olaf Harris Hammett, was Earl's mother's cousin. So you saw a lot of Root family members, Scruggs family members hanging out with the Hammets and vice versa. And so this was one of the first, or the first three-finger banjo player that Earl ever came into contact with, and he took a real interest in Earl.
Yeah, a couple of things about Smith Hammett. He was tragically killed at an early age, and he and one of the store owners, country store owner, had got into a quarrel, and Smith went into the store, I guess, in the stores that they were planning on beating him up. Well, the guy was waiting on him with a gun. He didn't beat him up because the guy killed Smith there. But, so it was very tragic, and I know, my dad was 18 and he was a pallbearer at Smith had his funeral. And another thing I'll tell you about Smith, he played a short banjo. He didn't play a banjo like that. His was a short banjo. And a couple of things I'll tell you about that. He was known to partake in a drink once in a while. Sometimes a lot. And one Sunday morning, he came by Rob's family and outside of Gay. And he knocked on the door and he told Mr. Robs that he needed $5 back. And he said, if you'll let me have $5, I'll leave my banjo. He did, and then he was killed shortly after that and never got his banjo back. And the Ross family still owns that banjo. I've been trying to get it on loan for the Scruggs Center. So far, I'm not a bit successful. But he left that there thinking he's coming back and get it. And another thing, Earl was honored in Shelby, Cleveland County. I guess it was in the fairly early 2000s. And there's a guy who I can't remember his name now that said he had Smith Hammond's banjo, and he wanted to present it to. I don't remember who it was, but turns out he didn't have it because he got up and presented the banjo to Earl, and Earl sat down and said, "That's not Smith Hammond's banjo." It turns out he was right because the Robs family has it. Yeah. So that's just a little bit about Smith Hammond and his banjo. But Earl recognized as soon as he sat down, because he played with Smith Hammond, he played that banjo. He sat down beside me and he said, "That's not Smith Hammond's banjo." And it wasn't, I didn't know it at the time either. I didn't know till later about the story that he loaned it to North Ross. And his sister told me that story.
And the story also goes that Smith Hammond was one of the first people to take interest in Earl as a young boy, as a musician. He and Earl would get together at these family gatherings and he would play something and then he would have Earl mimic it back. So even at 4 and 5 years old, Earl was able to mimic it back. And so he sort of understood the genius or, the prodigy that Earl was at that point. Smith also had a band, and so here's a picture of his band, and I circled Smith for you so you can see what he looked like. And these guys competed in, all sorts of competitions, and you'll see some other bands that competed in competitions in this area. They were sort of rivals. But he was primarily a sharecropper until his untimely death, as JT explained. I think he was about 42 years old when he passed away in 1930. Not that I know of. Another very important banjo player from this area is Snuffy Jenkins, and y'all might be familiar with Snuffy Jenkins. He was born in the Harris area in about 1908, and he was an early three-finger style player. His first instrument was fiddle, and then he started playing banjo. But I found this very interesting, and I've seen this recorded in several different publications, that he was the first banjo player to play a three-finger style on the radio, and that was as early as 1934 on WBT. At that point, he was with the Jenkins String Band, which you can see the picture up here. And making up that band was Snuffy Jenkins, DeWitt, his brother, a cousin, and a friend. So that's who was in the Jenkins String Band, and they competed in competitions all around the area. By 1936, he joined J. Maynor's Mountaineers, and then his probably most famous musical partner was Homer Pappy Sherrill. But in 1937, and I found this very interesting too, the Mountaineers recorded a few tracks, and it said it sounded so close to bluegrass that it was scary. So this was several years before Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, started recording with Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. But the Mountaineers were already recording things that sounded very much like Bill Monroe pre-Earl Scruggs. So I thought that was interesting. Snuffy Jenkins gave banjo lessons to Don Reno, and he was a major influence on Earl Scruggs and then later on Ralph Stanley. There's something else interesting. I can't say that if you look at the banjo he's holding, I can't say that this is the holy grail of all banjos. I can't really tell from this picture, but Snuffy owned a banjo that is now the most famous banjo in the entire world. It originally belonged to a banjo player named Fisher Henley, who was a North Carolina banjo champion, played on WBT radio. It was a 1930 Gibson Granado. Originally owned by Fisher Henley, and then Snuffy Jenkins bought it from him. Several years later, Don Reno bought it from him, and then fatefully in 1949, there was a trade where Don Reno traded the banjo and a guitar to Earl Scruggs for another banjo. So Earl Scruggs' banjo that he played throughout his career belonged to Snuffy Jenkins at one point. So it has just this great lineage, and now it's in the Country Music Hall of Fame. So I think that's really neat that there were two, banjo players from this area that owned the holy grail of banjos.
You know what I remember about Snuffy Jenkins, I was just young, this is going to tell you my age now. This was in the mid to late 40s. He would come to a little elementary school. I grew up in a #1 township in Cleveland County, which is south of the road. And he would come and he'd come to maybe 2 times a year and play at that elementary school. And I can remember he was a comedian, and he put his red hair on and his freckles. He was a ball to watch. I mean, I just remember him as a kid. That's what I remember about Snuffy Jenkins. He was a good banjo.
And he was kind of what banjo players were considered before Earl came along and made the banjo a very serious instrument. He was a great banjo. Snuffy was a great banjo player, but also had that comedic role within the band. So then it's important to talk about the Scruggs and the Root family. And so these were Earl's father's family and his mother's family. They were all very musical people. So Earl grew up in a very musical family. His father, George Elam, he played the fiddle and an open back banjo. He played a clawhammer style. His mother was Lula Root Scruggs. She played the pump organ. And then all his siblings, Earl was the youngest of 5. They all played music. JT's father, Junie, was the oldest, and he played banjo very well. The 2 girls, Rudy and Dula Mae, both played guitar. Did they play banjo as well, JT?
No, I think just guitar.
Just guitar. And then the youngest girl, the next one, Horace, he played guitar really well. And then, of course, you had Earl who played banjo and guitar. So they were a very musical family. But when we started doing research, we started finding that the Root family actually has a longer musical history. Earl's grandfather was a man named John David Root, and if you search through newspapers.com, particularly from upstate South Carolina, you see that he was a contest winner all the time. He was a very accomplished fiddler, and he died tragically. I say the Root family is a little bit cursed, but he died tragically when he was young, and there's a newspaper clipping from where he was murdered. And then he had some cousins, Lewis and Vester Root, who died tragically, injured tragically. They were well-known musicians in the area. And then other things that you see throughout newspapers, throughout research, is that the Root family, particularly in the Gaffney area, they were known for hosting these musical gatherings where musicians from all over this Broad River region would come and they would collaborate, and they were always winning contests all the time. And I love to include this picture of Earl and his 2 brothers. So you see Earl's in the forefront of the picture with the banjo. In the middle is Horace, who's playing guitar, and then in the back is JT's father, Junie. So now we'll talk a little bit about Earl's early life here, and this was in Cleveland County in the Flintville area. He was born January 6, 1924. Like I said, we'll be celebrating his 100th birthday. And he was born at home, in a home on Maple Springs Church Road, just south of Bowling Springs, and that home was owned by his grandfather, David Scruggs. His father, George Elam, like I said, played the banjo, played the fiddle. They were farmers, but he was also a quiet, sort of bookish man, and he was the treasurer for Bowling Springs Baptist Church. And then at that point, as with most families in the area, here right before the Depression, they were all working the farm. All the kids were working the farm. Mother Lula was raising the kids, she was keeping home, she was working the farm. And then, of course, they're all playing music. And so Earl begins playing banjo by age 4. And I love this story because I've read it several times about JT's daddy. He had a really nice banjo, and sometimes little Earl at 4 and 5 years old would borrow it and drag it across the floor and have to sit on the floor and put it on his lap and play it and scratch it up. And I think his older brother wasn't too happy about that.
Yeah, he wasn't. We had a picture of Earl and Dad going to a fiddler's convention up in Lincoln County, actually. And the banjo by himself. But he sat on Dad's knee and played the banjo and won the contest. And I think he was about 5 years old at that time, 5 or 5.5 old.
And this picture is a great picture. You can see that's probably typical of many families in this area at the time. Here you have Brother Junie, who's 13 years older than Earl, in the middle. On the right, on the mule is Earl, your right is Earl, and on the left is Horace, who's just a year and a half older than Earl.
Yeah, that was too close to a mule for Dad. He did not like farming.
So then in 1928, things get a little bit tougher for the Scruggs family because Earl's father, George Elam, passes away. He had about a year-long illness with what they think was stomach cancer at the time. And they're effectively displaced from their home down in Flint Hill. His grandfather, David Scruggs, owned the home, and when his son, George Elam, passed away, the home went to another member of the family. So the family had to find somewhere else to live, and so it's Earl's mother left with 5 children, and they have to find somewhere else to live. And so at that point, they moved to Rutherford County. They moved outside of Cliffside in the Ferry community, if anybody's familiar with that. They rented a farm, and in fact, it was Junie, who was 17 at the time, who rented the farm and took the rest of the family with him.
Tenant farm.
Yep, so Earl actually started school at the Ferry School in Cliffside, and he and his siblings walked about 3 miles back and forth to school every day. There's some interesting stories about how they pick crab apples and throw them and, things like that. But, at this time, Earl's about 4 to 6 years old that he starts entering competitions. In fact, the story is that he entered his first competition at 6 years old, and he walks to Bowling Springs carrying his daddy's banjo, and he wins it playing Cripple Creek. And he said he never knew if it was because he was actually good, or if he was just a cute little boy, or it was the judge's favorite song, we don't know. But he won at 6 years old playing Cripple Creek. And that's a picture of Earl and Horace about this time. Then in 1933, they sort of have a little bit of good luck. The grandfather, David Scruggs, passes away, and as his estate is divided up, the heirs of George Elam Scruggs get a farm. They get 40 acres and they get a house. So at this point, they move back to Flint Hill, and they start farming this 40 acres. This house is still standing. This is a picture of it today. So you see it's in not great shape, but it's still there off Riverside Road in Bowling Springs. And I just wanted to read something from Earl's own words. We have in our collection, in our archives, we have some of Earl's memoirs where he hand wrote about his life. And so I wanted to read what he said about the house, what they call the home place, a really important place to him in Flint Hill. It said, our house was framed, one with a large living room, which most of the time, and on part-time, 2 beds in it. Just one, and part-time, 2 beds in it. 1 bedroom and what we call the front room. This is where the couch, organ, and best bed with a feather tick mattress on it was, used only for Christmas and special events. A kitchen that consisted of a wood-burning majestic stove, covered, a long table, and 1 full-length bench and chairs on the other side and ends. Covered table and furniture like a desk, a clothes thing, trunks for storing quilts, etc. my father made. Our beds were straw, wheat tick, and our first mattress, I recall, was a 50-cent homemade variety. So this is where Earl and all the kids lived. So there wasn't much space in the house, and they all crammed in there. Now, at this point, JT's father had already married and moved out, and one of the sisters had already married and moved out of the house. But still, a small place, and they were all working hard on the farm.
Yeah, and didn't like it, none of it.
And there's a couple, and this home is really important when you talk about the history of music and the development of Earl's music, because there are a couple stories that happen here. Earl is known for having impeccable timing. And one thing he did to develop that was he and Horace would stand at the front of this house and start playing a song, one on guitar and one on banjo, and they would start walking in opposite directions. And if they met at the back of the house and they were on the same time, they knew they'd done it right, and that's how they practiced. And this was also the place where Earl discovered that he could play 3-finger style. So starting at age 4, he's playing a 2-finger style, but at 10 years old, he and Horace get in a fight. His mother separates them, and Earl goes to this front room that we're talking about, and he's mad, and he's just kind of playing the banjo, and then he realizes he's using that 3rd finger, and the song he's playing is Reuben. Could you play that for us? She's on the spot.
said he practiced it all that night and the next day, and he said late in the afternoon the next day, he was sitting on the porch playing Rubens three-finger style. He saw my dad coming up from towards the river, walking, and said he could see him doing that. He could see him doing that. Of course, Dad had been used to seeing him, he was listening to him play, two-finger style. And he said when Dad got up on the porch, he never said a word, just walked up to the door, opened the screen door, and turned around and said, "Is that all you know?" And went on in the house. He said, "Just busted me, my boys and all." Of course, Dad done this as a joke. He told a lot of great stories about the river and them growing up on the river, and particularly after everybody was gone except him and Horace. They'd go down to the river and set trot lines and set hooks and catch fish and play on the river. He told a funny story when he was in school. He just got to high school. And he went to high school up in Bowling Springs. And he said, of course, he'd never been in a car very much. They rode the horse and buggy most of the time. But agriculture teacher's name, some of you may know him, was Brooks Pearson from Bowling Springs. A great man. I mean, everybody I went to school with, he taught me and many other people. But he said, Mr. Piercy was carrying a group of the boys to Raleigh to do some kind of judging. I think it was cattle, maybe. And he said, and I got selected to go. And I'd never been out of Cleveland County except to two cowpens on the horse and buggy. And he said, I walked all the way from the river home to Bowling Springs to get to ride with Mr. Piercy to Raleigh. And he said, Mother gave me a quarter. I get to spend the whole quarter. And he said, Mr. Piercy got in and turned around and told the boys, said, now, when I get low on gas, y'all can get you something to drink and eat. He said, I thought he'd never run out of gas. He said, we got almost to Raleigh before he stopped to get gas. Everybody was wanting to run out of gas. Yeah, he thought a lot of Mr. Piercy. Earl really truly loved coming back home. And he was a very humble guy. And I tell people this all the time, if you didn't know Earl, and you run into him and talk to him, you'd think he still lived in Plainfield. I mean, he just never lost that. He was also smart enough to do and became, I'd say, relatively famous. He'd done okay. But he loved coming back home, and he loved being roots. He still loved liver mush. For those of you who had liver mush, he loved it. I used to ship it to him in ice, dry ice. Yeah. But he loved it. And one time my Aunt Louise said, quit sending that stuff up here. We'll keep sending it.
That sort of brings us to a good spot where in 1942, Earl graduates from Bowling Springs High School. And at this point, the family leaves the farm in Flint Hill. After he graduates from high school, he begins working at the Lily Mill in Shelby, making at first less than 40 cents an hour, but at the most 40 cents an hour. After they leave Flint Hill and they move to Bowling Springs, and if you're familiar with downtown Bowling Springs, they rent homes somewhere in the KFC area right there off Main Street. There's a few homes there. Can you just press presentation mode? Give me help. What? I said, if you'll just hit presentation mode, that'd be great. Yeah, sorry. It's okay. I just want y'all to see the images. We can do this, but I love the pictures and for you guys to see that. Thank you so much. And so he graduates, and then they move to Lily Mill, and then after they live in Bowling Springs for a year or two, Earl saves up some money, and he buys a $3,000 house in the Lily Mill village. The story goes is after he graduates high school, his mother calls up a friend and says, can you get Earl a job at the Lily Mills? His mother didn't work. His younger sister, who was still in the house, didn't work. Said, we're basically going to starve if Earl doesn't start working at the mill. And so he got the job there. And here's a picture of Earl while he's an employee. So you see him circled over here on the left. And then the man that I have circled over on the right is someone we'll talk about in a minute. His name's Grady Wilkie, and he's an important musical mentor to Earl. But they often play music during the breaks. And if you read anything about mill villages and mills in Cleveland County and Rutherford County, music was a really important part of life around the mills. And it certainly was true for Earl. in the Lily Mills. I'll tell you a little bit about Grady Wilkie. He was born in 1912. I'm not exactly sure where he was born. If anybody knows, I'd love to know. But he began working at the Cliffside Mill, and that's when he started playing music. He was a member of this band called the Dewey McDaniel Band, and I have him circled there. And they were a rival of the Smith Hammock Band. I told you the Jenkins String Band, the Smith Hammock Band, this Dewey McDaniel Band. They were all rivals in different, music competitions. There's even stories about them stealing each other's instruments, so somebody else won't win. But at some point, he starts working at the Lily Mill, and that's when he helps Earl get a job there. And they become good friends, and he becomes a musical mentor for Earl. He introduces Earl to some of his first bands, including the Morris Brothers, who Earl starts playing with in the early 40s. And then Lost John Miller out of Knoxville hears Earl play, and he wants to hire Earl. So this is Earl's first full-time job as a musician, and it's Grady Wilkie who drives him to Knoxville and helps move to Knoxville to be a part of that. And I love this quote from some of Earl's memoirs about Grady Wilkie. He says, "Me and Grady Wilkie would sit in the back seat of my 36 Chevy and play music. He played guitar and I'd play banjo until they motioned us to come back into the mill. That's when I finally realized that I was doing something of interest to other people. They'd stand around and watch us pick. One of them hadn't heard nothing like that before, and he took his hat off, threw it on the ground, and said, 'Hot damn, that's hard on the hat.'" I just love that thought that, even at this point, Earl's music, kind of overcomes people to the point where they can't stand it and have to throw their hat on the ground and dance. So that's pretty neat. And so I think it's important also to talk about the radio. The Scruggs family, when Earl was young, they didn't have a radio in the home, but this was the way that rural families could connect to the outside world. So by the 20s, late 20s, Earl's listening to the radio and he's hearing things like Grand Ole Opry and the Carter family in the 30s. In fact, there's this great story that Earl tells where he says that he's listening to the Grand Ole Opry. They gather at a neighbor's house because they don't have a radio, so everybody would gather at whoever's home has a radio. And he said that he knew that he could hear them, but he was afraid to utter a word because he didn't know if they could hear him. And so he's a young boy listening to the radio. And so this is how they're listening to music from the outside world. But it's also really important for musicians like Earl and Snuffy Jenkins, these regional musicians, because now they're finally able, through the radio stations, they're able to get their music out to the world. So by the 40s, most homes had a radio. It wasn't an unusual thing anymore. So you had station WBT in Charlotte, which was a big deal. They had the Crazy Crystal Barn Dance show, which everybody listened to, kind of like the Grand Ole Opry. And then you had WSPA in Spartanburg, where Earl was playing with Horace, where Earl was playing with the Morris Brothers and playing with others. And then later he'll move to Knoxville with Lost John Miller and the Allied Kentuckians. And then finally he'll go with Bill Monroe to WSN in Nashville. But this is where Earl's music is, starting to get out to the masses. This is a great picture of Earl and Horace about the time they're traveling around and playing on the radio in their late teens. And then, of course, this brings us to the big bang of bluegrass. I told you that Earl's first job, he leaves the mill. His first job after the mill is with Lost John Miller. It's short-lived, maybe a year or so. But during that time, Earl's being noticed by people in the music industry. Particularly, he had a friend named Jim Shoemate, who was a fiddler from Hickory, who was the fiddler with Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. He had been bugging Earl to try out for Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, especially after String Bean, you might be familiar with him, Dave Aikman, left that band. He asked Earl to audition for Bill Monroe, and Earl said no. He said, "I'm with Lost John, I'm happy with that. I've heard Bill Monroe is hard to work for, I don't need to do that." But then on December 1st, 1945, Lost John Miller's in Nashville, and he tells the band, "I'm disbanding the band." So Earl immediately calls up Jim Shoemate and says, "I'm ready for that audition." And so he does audition at the Tulane Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, and the rest is history. Just a week later, Earl comes on the Opry for the very first time with Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, and that's what they call the birth of bluegrass, or the big bang of bluegrass. The first time that you get Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt and Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, and that's the time that sort of that quintessential sound of bluegrass is formed, and it's all around Earl's banjo. And it's just his hard driving style is different than anything anyone had ever heard on a national level. And then you see bands after that start, mimicking that and trying to get three-finger style banjo players. So there's a picture of the plaque that's outside the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, recognizing the birth of bluegrass on December 8, 1945. And then I love this photo. This is from our collection at the Earl Scruggs Center. That was part of Earl's personal collection of photos. It's a picture of early bluegrass boys. I mean, Earl's probably 21 years old right there. He just joined the Bluegrass Boys, and you see a young Bill Monroe in the top center of that. Lester Flatt's off to the right. So from 45 until 48, he travels with Bill Monroe. It is difficult. So they're in this car over here on the left, and I'll let JT describe the car in just a second, but they're in that car, basically 7 days a week. They're playing radio stations in the mornings, they're playing schoolhouses, places like that in the evening, and then they've got to be back for the Opry every single weekend. So they are just burning up the road in this car. Earl talks about how they put their instruments on top, how they have to sleep sitting up like this, and the pay's not great. Bill's paying them about $60 a week. They're having to pay for their own rooms when they do get to stay in a hotel and actually sleep in the bed. They have to pay for their own food. They're all dry cleaning. So about the end of the week, they don't really have any money left for all this work.
Yeah, he said by the time he got through paying all the bills and then sending Granny Scruggs some money back, he didn't have anything left.
Yeah, so it wasn't great.
And he's still making payments on that $3,000 house.
But that also wasn't unusual for the time. I'm not saying that Bill Monroe was a terrible employer. That was pretty typical for his
This vehicle's pretty interesting, and he said initially they were just a regular sedan, and he said it was awful. The whole band crammed in that car with instruments. But he said then they decided they needed something bigger, so they got this limousine. The way they got the limousine, and if you see certain pictures of it, you can tell. They took two different vehicles, cut them down, and put them together. And they were held together with refrigerator hinges. That's how they put them together and fastened them together.
Apparently Bill Monroe was also a terrible driver. And so one night he crashed them and they were upside down and they were all surprised that they were alive and they crawled out and they never let him drive again. So Earl gets tired of this lifestyle. It's really difficult. He's not making a lot of money. And he decides that he's going to move back to Shelby. He's going to work in the mill. He's going to take care of his mom and his sister. So in 1948 he resigns. And just a couple weeks later, Lester Flatt decides to resign too, and they decide. And then after Earl's already back in Shelby, Lester reaches out and contacts him and says, hey, do you want to try to make a go of this music thing? And we'll go on our own. So they decided to team up and they formed Flatt and Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys. And this is probably, if not the earliest, one of the earliest pictures of the Foggy Mountain Boys. And you know because Jim Shoemate, he is to the left of Lester Flatt, he's the fiddler. He's in the band, and he was in the band for only about 6 months. So you know that this is a really early photo of the Foggy Mountain Boys. Life was still difficult. They were jumping around from radio station to radio station. A lot of times these bands would have a regular morning show, like a 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. radio show. I think Flatt and Scruggs went to Bristol. They were there for a little while. They were in Raleigh for a while. They were in Spartanburg for a while. So they're basically bouncing around from radio station to radio station, but then also traveling all around the region playing shows in the evening. And I love this picture in the top right corner. That's them playing at a drive-in movie theater, and they're on top of the, the little building. Yeah, the concession stand area. And so that was not unusual. Yeah, and they may or may not make money at these shows. So it was still challenging. And so this was, the early 50s that they were doing
He said sometimes they're just going to starve. At the end of the weeks, many weeks, he said you could take the bank.
Said they had them high heads. If they got them down, they can't get in here.
I'll tell you a funny story about it. It's funny about when Earl came home before he and Lester got together. He said, when they played the opera, it was in the old Ryman building. And the old Ryman building initially, and the first time I ever saw it, it had 5,000 seats in it. Today it's about 26, 2700. Because they didn't have dressing room. They didn't have a great big stage. And he said he was playing there, and he kept seeing this young lady sitting out. She'd come home Saturday nights. And finally he asked one of his friends, said, you know who that is? He said, we'd smile at one another. They said, oh yeah, I know where you want to meet her. So they met in the alley behind Ryman. And her name, of course, was my Aunt Louise. And she was from Tennessee also, just a little, come off from a farm, just a little ways off. And he said he got home and he got to thinking, you know, I really like Louise. And I left and didn't tell her. So he goes somewhere in Shelby and finds a payphone and calls her and asks her if she'd like to get married. On the phone. She said yes, and he said, well, you catch the bus and I'll pick you up Sunday morning in Yankee, South Carolina. So they were still going to church at Bowling Springs, he and Granny were, Earl Scruggs. He said he got there and pulled up and Granny Scruggs said, Earl, there's a parking place. No, Mom, you just get out and go in church and I'll pick you up at the church. What do you mean? Well, I'm going to get married. He hadn't been told. So, sure enough, he goes to Gaffney and picks Louise up at the bus station. Thank God it was on time, he wouldn't have got Granny Scruggs. They go down to Justice Peace, get married, and come back and pick Granny Scruggs up and go on. That was his experience getting married.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I wanted to talk for a minute about Louise. So at this time, you have these bluegrass bands. It's just now starting to be called bluegrass at the time, popping up, kind of mimicking Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, and then of course Flatt and Scruggs. But Flatt and Scruggs became very successful for many reasons. I mean, they were unbelievably talented. They had Earl Scruggs, but they also had Louise Scruggs. She became the first professional manager in all of country music. So originally she was just booking them some. She was their bookkeeper. She was sort of their business manager. But eventually by 1955, she took over all the business affairs. She was making decisions on what they were recording, when they were recording. The story goes with the Beverly Hillbillies. When that was pitched to them, originally Louise said no, because they're not going to be portrayed as hillbillies. We worked hard to create this professional image. And so that's when they came back to them and said, listen, the hillbillies are going to be smarter than the bankers. And so Louise said, that might work. And she was also the one who had them record the Ballad of Jed Clampett, and it became the first #1 country hit for any bluegrass band. So it's Louise's brilliance in her management that made Flatt and Scruggs so successful through these years, and we'll talk about that. So it's really important that we talk about Louise. Even today, she's still honored every year by the Country Music Hall of Fame. They have the Louise Scruggs Memorial Forum, where they give an award to a woman who's performed exceptionally well in music business. So every year someone gets an award in honor of Louise Scruggs. And so by the mid-50s, so by the time Louise starts managing them, they're really famous. Of course, they get the Martha White television show, the Flatt and Scruggs show. It's a 30-minute show. They joined the Grand Ole Opry in 1955, even though Bill Monroe did his best to keep them off. And this was a time, if you look at the history of country music, and if you watch the Ken Burns documentary, country music acts were struggling because of one thing: rock and roll, Elvis Presley. But Flatt and Scruggs, they were still doing well, and they were still traveling, and there were some reasons for that. One of them being the television. So in 1962, you have the debut of the Beverly Hillbillies, which of course, the theme song, the Ballad of Jed Clampett, was a Flatt and Scruggs song, and so Earl's banjos featured prominently in that. And you see Flatt and Scruggs appearing periodically on the TV show. You want to play us a little bit of Ballad of Jed Clampett? And then keep your banjo out. For many of us, that's our first memory of Earl Scruggs. I mean, that's my first memory is of seeing reruns of the Beverly Hillbillies and hearing that song. Another thing that really sort of kind of catapulted them to international fame was, of course, Bonnie and Clyde, and the fact that Foggy Mountain Breakdown was featured as the theme song in Bonnie and Clyde. And the story goes that Warren Beatty heard Flatt and Scruggs, was a big fan of Flatt and Scruggs, and asked Earl to write a theme song for it. And so Earl was working on, composing a new theme song, but then Warren Beatty called him back and said, I found it. I want that 1949 recording, Foggy Mountain Breakdown. And so then the rest, of course, is history. And now that's considered probably the most popular song in the whole bluegrass canon. It's certainly what they call like national anthem of bluegrass banjo players. You want to play a little Foggy Mountain Breakdown? In 1969, but before that they became the most popular and influential bluegrass band of all time, and I would argue that with anybody in the world. They played Carnegie Hall. Of course, they were featured in film, featured in television. They toured Japan. I love this picture. It's from our collection. That's when they toured Japan right before they broke up in like 67, 68. They were famous internationally. So these are just some of their album covers here, and if you look at the top right-hand corner of that Foggy Mountain Banjo, a lot of banjo players point to that album as the one that inspired them, or the moment that they decided that they wanted to become banjo players. And so after Earl and Lester broke up in 1969, they broke up musical differences. Earl loved to explore, to innovate, to do different things. Lester wanted to play more traditional bluegrass at the time. So Earl formed this folk rock band with his sons, Gary, Randy, and Steve, and it was called the Earl Scruggs Revue. They toured through the 70s and the 80s, and they were also really popular. They performed all across the nation. They performed internationally. They were very popular on college campuses. At one point, they were, I was told by one Scruggs son that they were #1 in draw for a period of time on college campuses. But then we have another one that said that they were second in draw on college campuses, second only to Elton John at the time. So they were really popular. They were playing for 40,000 to 50,000 people at a time. And of course, they collaborated with a wide variety of artists. And here's some photos from our collection. Here's a picture in the top right-hand corner of Earl and Randy and Gary Scruggs, his sons, playing with Bob Dylan. And then the larger picture is Earl and John McEwen, and that's from the recording of the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album in 1972. So it was folks like that Earl was collaborating with, Joan Baez, Linda Ronstadt at the time. He was very much in the forefront of popular music.
And you can see a lot of that on YouTube. Him with Joan Baez and their own and different people. A lot of that you find on YouTube.
And then later in his career, Earl continued to perform until the 1980s, and even some beyond that. And he recorded, with all kinds of artists from various genres. Earl was never limited to just bluegrass or just country music, and I think that's what made him the influential artist that he was. He was certainly an innovator, and he was always trying to do something different. In 2001, he released Earl Scruggs and Friends. And there were folks on that album like Steve Martin and Johnny Cash and Elton John and Sting. And he won a Grammy for that. And then in 2003, he appeared on the PBS special, The Three Pickers, with Doc Watson and Ricky Skaggs, and JT actually drove Earl to that filming.
That was a fun day. They came into town the night before the city and county was doing something for Earl. And so we got up the next morning to go to Winston-Salem, where they were going to do this, and I told them I'd carry on. And the bus was coming in with the boys on it to make up the rest of the band, to meet them out there. Well, we got up and got ready to go and sleep. I went to sleep hard. And we stopped over at a restaurant, and it's my first time to ask Aunt Louise about the possibility of having an Earl Scruggs museum. And while she was really friendly and nice, she was a shrewd businesswoman. And I remember we were sitting there, and Earl was eating his liver mush, and I getting up trying to get the nerve to ask her. She was sitting across the table from me, and she wore glasses kind of like this. And I said, Louise, we've been talking, we think we'd like to do a museum for Earl. And she said, what? What do you want to do? And I told her again, it took me 6 months to convince her to do it. But anyway, we went on and it started snowing. And we left her, I left them in a hotel in Winston-Salem. Everything was shut down. All the restaurants and everything was shut down. And they had nowhere to travel. And I had to get back home because my mother had a heart attack. I didn't know it at the time, but my wife called me. But that morning, after I left. And so I left them there with the hotel manager promising me that they wouldn't go hungry. That he would get them some food from somewhere. And he did. He took care of it. She said, really took good care of it. But that's when they done the 3 pictures. They done it in a hotel, snowed in. I think they actually went somewhere downtown and done the televised. Yeah.
But that's a great program if you get a chance to watch it. Just one little plug, we do have it for sale in the gift shop at Earl Scruggs. So Earl won a lot of awards. He's in the Country Music Hall of Fame. He's in the IVMA Hall of Fame. He won 4 Grammy Awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award. So just a long list of awards that Earl won throughout his career. But his legacy is really important because even though he passed away in 2012, his legacy lives on in a variety of ways. I mean, he continues through his music, and we saw that this weekend at the festival. He continues to inspire musicians. A lot of young musicians are trying to play Scruggs style, and they want to be just like him, and they learn about his life and his career, and they want to do creative and innovative things like he did. I love this quote from Marty Stewart from Bela Fleck. Marty Stewart said, "He was the man who melted walls, and he did it without saying 3 words. He was very quiet." Bela Fleck said, "My most powerful memory was hearing Earl Scruggs on the Beverly Hillbillies as a 5 or 6-year-old. That sound just blew me away and shook my head up." And we all know what kind of musician Bela Fleck is. And I love this quote from Earl because I think this sums up who he was and what he was trying to do with his music. He says, "You can't encore the past. That's done and done. And you can't re-record something all your life. You'll just sit on the bank and let the boat pull out and leave you. If I can see a light shining further out, I want to see where it's coming from." And that's who he was. So today we have the Earl Scruggs Center that recognizes and honors the legacy of Earl Scruggs, and we also celebrate the history of the region, the cultural traditions of the region. And we've been open for 9 years. We'll be celebrating 10 years in January, and we've had visitors from 50 states and from over 20 countries visit the Earl Scruggs Center. A lot of folks are coming because they like museums, but a lot of people are kind of coming on that pilgrimage because they love Earl Scruggs. And these are some of the things we offer. We have a wide variety of programs, some wonderful exhibits. We have educational opportunities for people of all ages, but we're very proud of the educational music opportunities that we offer for children, like the Bluegrass Ambassadors program. And then, of course, we have the Earl Scruggs Music Festival, which is relatively new. We just finished our 2nd year of that with our wonderful partners here at Isothermal, WNCW, and the Tryon International Equestrian Center. We had a wonderful event this past weekend. You see there's Emmylou Harris and Jerry Douglas and children playing, and it was honestly just a wonderful celebration of Earl, of the music that he helped create and the music that, came originally from this region. We've talked about those musicians who came before Earl and influenced him. So it was just a wonderful celebration of all that. And I just encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to visit the Scruggs Center, if you haven't had a chance to attend the festival the last 2 years, I encourage you to make plans to do that. So I think that wraps up our presentation. We've kept you a little over an hour, but we'll blame the storm on that. But if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them if we can.
I was wondering why Louise was hesitant to have a museum.
Well, she was not, I don't think, hesitant to have the museum. Louise was a person, and maybe there's some history that maybe some people had tried to take advantage of her and different things. So it didn't matter what you brought to Louise, she was going to completely, she was going to completely understand it before she approved it. Just like the Beverly Hillbillies. She said no. And then, and the way they got her to change that was the guy called her and said, about 3 months after that, I've got a video I'd like to show you. And she said, well, you know, if you want to waste your money coming from California to come here, my answer's still no, come on if you want to do it. So he did and showed him a video, and that's where the hillbillies were smarter than the bankers. And she said, oh, well, maybe we'll do that. And she said, JT, I'm telling you, you should have kicked my tail if I hadn't done it, because that's the best thing that ever happened to us.
And another thing about Louise is that she was very protective of the image and of the brand. She understood marketing and branding well before those were even terms. Like, for example, on the screen that we had some album covers, she hired a specific artist, and his name was Thomas Allen, to design the Flat and Scruggs album covers because she wanted them all to have a specific look. That if you're in the record store and you're flipping through, you don't have to see the name Flat and Scruggs to know that that's their album cover. She was just such a good business person that she understood branding at that time in the 50s. So image was really important to her.
Yeah, she worked very hard at it. Her day was, she'd get up around lunch and go to bed around 4 a.m. Yeah, and when we first started doing the research and the work on the projects, she told me one time, you never call me before noon. You just don't call me before noon. And I didn't call him. But one Monday morning, I had to go into work early, and it was about 1 a.m., and she called me. And she had 2 or 3 questions. And I tried to answer them. And got through, and she said, oh, JT, I didn't wake you up, did you? I said, no, I always stay up past 1 o'clock. She said, oh, so I gave you rules, you just didn't give me any.
Any other questions?
Well, I'd just like to say a comment. I grew up in Cliffside in the 50s, and there were just numerous men that would talk about a jam session with Earl. I mean, he was just all over the Cliffside area. And as a matter of fact, we've got one going in our family that he picked on my grandmother's front porch with just a bunch of locals. And that was just a common thing in the 40s. And then when they became Flat and Scruggs, all the men, you know, they were in a 40 or 50 mile radius here all the time. You know, Lincoln, Gastonia, or Spartanburg, or wherever. And they would all go, you know, to Flat and Scruggs concert. And I was fortunate enough, I was at Garden Web in the 70s, and Earl Scruggs' venue came to Garden Web. And Gary and Randy were there, and it was just great. I mean, I was of college age, and yes, it was a change, and yes, I remember Flat and Scruggs, but it was great, great, great music.
Yeah, Earl always loved that. He loved jamming. When he'd come home, they'd go to get together generally down at Horace, in fact. Dad and Earl and Horace, and they bring other people in. Dean Jinks is a good banjo player from Shelby. And he talked about they did, and when it was the first time they invited him to come and jam. But he just loved doing that. He loved helping other musicians. But he was just a very humble person, and he absolutely loved getting together and coming home and being around people around here.
Do you think it was unique for this area to have these jam parties?
No, I don't necessarily say it was unique to have jam parties, because I think they've probably done that in other areas and other kinds of music. But he just loved being a part of it. I can remember going to one of his birthday parties and in Nashville. Louise gave him a birthday party every January. And they had a relatively large home. And first one I went to, she said, JT, you're going to greet people when they come in. This old country boy. They got me out here greeting all these musicians coming in. That ain't right. But finally, I done what Louise told me to do. I went and done it.
That's what you do.
And people coming in bringing instruments, and I'm thinking, well, now do they maybe trade them? What do they do? Why are they all bringing these instruments as birthday party? I found out at 7 o'clock. In their living room, which was quite large, I counted 40 different musicians sitting around the wall, Earl in the middle of it, jamming, and they went to 1 a.m. And I heard some great music.
Who were some of the folks there, JT?
Well, Travis Tritt, that's a story of his own. He was there, but Ricky Skaggs, the Whites, there's a lot of different people there. I don't remember all their names. But Vince Gill was known to go to those birthday parties. Jerry Douglas was there. A lot of different people were there.
No.
But I was I know my first experience with Travis Tritt, and he's done several concerts now at the theater. But my first experience with Travis Tritt was we was sitting, my wife and I were sitting over here at the door. All these people were playing. And Travis Tritt had been on a trip on a show. He lived in Atlanta at the time. He said he got in and he told his wife to get the car. We're going to her birthday party. And she said, we're not going to get there. It's late. He said, we're going. So, and I never even know Travis Tritt from anything. And I turned around and when they come in and he had on jeans that had holes in them, little hats on top of his head. I didn't know who he was. Beautiful lady on his arm, his wife. I turned around and I saw him, I punched my wife. His son dude was trying to get in. She looked at me and she said, "You fool, that's Travis Tritt." It was.
What is the status of the house in Flint Hill? Will the center try to acquire that property or?
Interesting. We have had some talks about that. And we're still in some communications. The house is in real bad shape. And the people that own it, they're more interested in keeping the property it sits on. There's been some talk of moving it. We don't know, what it might cost us to move it if we tried to do that. But it would still be the original place to me. It'd be the house, but it wouldn't be where Earl and everybody grew up. But I don't know. I just say the jury's still out on that one.
But the short answer is we'd love to save it if we can.
We'd love to. We've had some serious conversations with them.
All right. Any other questions?
Great program.
Yeah.
We just want to take a moment to thank you, Mary Beth, and JT and Roger for coming out and sharing so much of Earl's life with us. It's amazing to get such personal insight and to hear these stories. And I think anyone who's from this area has a little bit of bluegrass in their DNA. So this it just hit home for a lot of us. And hearing those stories has made for a really great evening. So we really appreciate that. We also want to say thank you to all of you who came out tonight. I know the weather kind of threw us for a little bit of a loop. I don't know if you guys knew that was coming, but I did not. So I'm glad that you hung in there with us and stayed with us tonight. We will be having our second History Matters session on the first Thursday in October on the myths and legends of Rutherford and Polk counties. Our History Matters committee member, Clint Tuttle, has really taken the reins with this one and has an amazing lineup of stories and legends for us. I personally love every one of them, and it's kind of a good reminder again of our roots, of where we're from, and what makes this part of North Carolina and of the world unique. So we really hope you'll come out and join us for that the first Thursday in October, October 5th. And just a quick reminder of the survey. Again, you have a couple ways you can do that. You can use the QR code on the back of the bookmark to go straight to the link, type the link into your address bar on your computer, or if you would like a paper copy, we do have those in the back. But we'd like to again say thank you for coming out, and we hope we'll see you again. Drive safely, and see you in October.